when Yerama asked me to speak about the Reformation, it actually brought up all sorts of graduate student day wounds, because I went to University of Chicago, as I just mentioned. And so what I'm going to do is offer just a few reflections, maybe aphorisms and provocations, really, about the problem. And one thing I will say, for all my immense reverence for Straussianism, I think that the heuristic is terribly off. So the hermeneutic, which is a deep reverence for texts, hermeneutics of deference, if you will, I think we are internally indebted to Strauss for this. But I think he did us a tremendous disfavor by giving us the heuristics of ancient modern and virtue versus self-interest, because it literally makes it impossible for us to hear anything in the Reformation in the early modern thinkers like Hobbes and Locke. Now, I'm going to say a bit more about that. First, I want to make a kind of Nietzschean observation. In my darker moments, I actually read Nietzsche a lot, but he should be read, but not seriously listened to. But I think he's onto something. He's onto something very, very important. So and Strauss, by the way, saw this. Nietzsche's assessment of the current moment, here I'm going to modify something Yerama just said. Nietzsche's assessment of the current moment is that modern man wants morality, but not religion, to which Strauss says you can't have it both ways. And so the missionaries of the 19th and 18th century went out to bring Christianity, and the missionaries of the 20th and 21st century go out to bring democracy, because that's the moral implications. This is Nietzsche's point, that the fuller implications of Judaism and Christianity are democracy. So we aren't willing to adhere to the religion, but Nietzsche thought the crisis of the modern age was that, not to get too technical, but because the will had so been turned back on itself with thou shalt not of the monotheisms, that the will no longer was willing to will anew, and so modern man was stuck, still hanging on to some parts of religion, but not others. And so his view was that we would see the democratization of the world on secular grounds, but that's still Christianity in disguise. But here's what I think Nietzsche didn't see far enough into his thesis. So there are other pieces of this religion which survive. Yes, we're taught secularism, we're not taught the Bible, but there are other pieces of this religious bit that continue to survive. The notion of debt. Debt without the theological completion, which is forgiveness. And so you have this tremendous sense of debt and guilt in Europe, which now shows up as a self-destructive position on open borders, because there's no way to get rid of the guilt, the debt that the Europeans feel as colonial powers. You also have debt surviving in a perverse way, right? Grace is supposed to get rid of debt, but we've in a way done away with the grace part of getting rid of debt, and so we are living in a world where debt keeps accumulating, fiscal debt keeps accumulating. It's as if we're living at the age beyond debt. So here too, we've got a kind of theological survival in terms of fiscal absolute irresponsibility. And then the third thing, and I wrote about this, thankfully Rusty accepted this Sex and Sin in Protestant America piece on First Things a few weeks before the election, is the category of purity and stain, which continues to live very powerfully, especially in the Democratic Party, in the form of identity politics. And Derek and I will talk a bit about this tomorrow. But identity politics is a survival in secular form of Puritan notions of purity and stain. So it's not that we've simply turned away from religion here. I think Nietzsche is right. We have survivals of it. And so my suggestion is it's already here. It's not that we have to bring religion back in. It's here in deeply destructive ways because we don't have full accounts of debt and forgiveness, for example. And so we have, look at the great crisis. We've got the immigration crisis. We've got identity politics. And we have fiscal crises. And these are all, in my view, survivals of deeply theological categories which no longer allow theological answers. So we're still in a quasi-religious world. And here I do agree with Yoram. The only way out of this, we have two ways out here. Let's be Nietzsche. Either we completely overcome this and get past the theological language in its entirety, get rid of debt and guilt, or we return to it fully so that we have adequate ways to comprehend purity, stain, debt, forgiveness. And I think Yoram is absolutely right. We are at the crossroads, and we could either go the Nietzschean route or we're going to have to return. There really isn't a choice on this one. So that's the first thing I wanted to raise. Since 1995, I've been a Tocqueville scholar. And the reason why I'm a Tocqueville scholar was after Chicago, I wrote this little book called Not by Reason Alone 23 years ago, in which I tried to suggest that that the Reformation mattered, that the story that we get of Hobbes and Locke is the wrong story. And as I said last night over dinner, and I heard Rusty chuckle about this, and everyone should chuckle about this one. You know, there's something strong, wrong with an account of the early moderns, say Hobbes and Locke. If a Marxist scholar like C.B. Macpherson and Leo Strauss can agree that Hobbes and Locke are just preparing the ground for individualism, there's something very seriously wrong with that account. Now, Marxists need Hobbes and Locke to be individualists because they want to see them as philosophical justifications for an emerging bourgeoisie. And Strauss wants to see it because he is wedded to this heuristic of ancient virtue, modern self-interest. And I got into Chicago in '84, but I was admitted both to Divinity School and the Political Science Department. So I would go back and forth between Joe Cropsey's lectures and Alan Bloom on the one hand, and then go over to Divinity School and listen to Robin Lovin and Langdon Gilkey and David Tracy, who would read these early modern figures as theologians, as if they actually meant what they said. And yet within, I think, the Straussian confine, you really had to do immense acrobatics in order to disregard the larger narrative. I hate that postmodern word, but I use it. Larger narrative within which they set their political theorizing. So I'll come right to the point. So my argument was the fundamental break that occurred, if you want to say there was a break, it's not Machiavelli. It's not Hobbes. And Strauss in two different places says each of these things. And the way we actually structure our courses, modern political philosophy, ancient medieval, is around this pivot point. Yes. My argument on behalf of the Reformation, so to speak, which I see as the thing that Strauss could not see, and the Marxists cannot see, it's not just Strauss, is that the great wager that gets made is by Luther in the early 1500s, and it's the following. So everything Luther says about Aristotle, he says Aristotle's just completely wrong. Now, why does he go after Aristotle? So the wager of Aristotle and the wager of Aquinas for the church after Aquinas is that the orders of reality can be understood analogically. So the joints of reality are analogical. And Luther's argument, and this is the complete repudiation of Aquinas and Aristotle, is that no, an analogy, the joints of reality are not understood analogically, they're to be understood historically. Okay? And so it's the great pivot, really, between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And so the question becomes, and you're going to see where I'm going with this, the question that the reformers are asking was not about the analogical ordering of nature, which God creates, but rather, what is the meaning of the fulfillment? It's Matthew 5:17 of the new, the old by the new. Now, my argument about Hobbes and Locke, very briefly, is that yes, they have a contract theory. Of course they do. But what's curious about their contract theory is that they each come up with a different sort of contract. Right? And so why is it that Hobbes comes up with Leviathan? Why is it that Locke ends up coming up with justifications of property, tolerance, right of revolt. These are different. And my argument is we have focused too inordinately on the contract portion and paid almost no attention to what I call the politically authoritative history within which they position their political ruminations. And so nobody reads parts 3 and parts 4 of Hobbes' Leviathan. Nobody pays attention to the fact that John Locke spent the last 15 years of his life thinking through the meaning of the epistles of Paul, for example. Nobody pays any attention to this because there's a need. There's a need to make Hobbes and Locke these thinkers who inaugurate this tradition of individualism. So I think this is actually a serious, serious problem. If I had more time, and I don't, I would, of necessity, talk about the dangers inherent in supersessionist doctrines. Because you can get anti-Semitism, you get this in Luther and Hegel. I can't go into this, but it would be very important to consider this. One thing I would say is this book is Luther, Hobbes, and Locke, showing that they're all concerned with biblically authoritative history. The chapter that I omitted was Hegel's early theological writings, and I think you can therefore show a continuity between Luther, Hobbes, and Locke, and then what becomes theses about history, the dialectical unfolding of history, and in Hegel, subsequently Marx, and the complete repudiation of this in Nietzsche. There's a whole story you can tell here, which I think is a terribly important story. But I want to turn away from Luther and just talk about Calvin for a moment and the Puritans. So, yes, I took classes from the Straussians in Chicago, but looking back on it, the person who I think most profoundly affected me was David Greenstone, who probably you even know about. He's an American. He studied with Strauss and then came back to Chicago and taught and died prematurely of cancer. But I remember sitting in his office one day. He said, "You know, Mitchell, here's the story. I know Strauss's argument, but my answer to Strauss is the Puritans. It's this covenantal theology of John Calvin." And so while so many of us were reading and revering Strauss, and there are reasons that we do this, the other Jewish thinker that nobody reads or did read at the time, maybe they're starting to read now, is Daniel Elazar, who very, very carefully showed federal liberty understandings that you had in the Puritans dating back to the Hebrew Bible. And this was David Greenstone's answer to Leo Strauss. It's not ancients moderns. It's not that the whole modern world has fallen apart because we've turned to self-interest. It's, now I'll make it even more subtle, but what Greenstone said was, it is the Puritan, but it's Sackman Berkovich plus Lewis Hartz. Another way of putting this is, it's a liberal tradition plus. It's not just the liberal tradition. It's both and. It's this Puritan tradition as well. So I think if you do it that way, you're able to see Hobbes and Locke not as inaugurators of this tradition of mere self-interest. I mean, is it lurking in there? I suppose. But my view is these aren't radically individuated individuals. These people, the citizens of Hobbes and Locke, are already bound by the biblical narrative. And that's the reason why they come up with the peculiar form of politics that they each come up with. Another way of putting this is that Hobbes and Locke are not John Rawls, or they're not John Stuart Mill. And when you get to Rawls and Mill, then you are released from the biblical horizon within which I think Hobbes and Locke were already working. Let me say a few things, in a slightly different direction, about why Trump won, and these would be my contribution to the question about nationalism. So I came out with a political piece a while ago, which sought to elaborate the reasons why Trump might win. I had to say in political that I didn't think he would because they weren't going to publish my piece. Otherwise, it's quite clear. That's how it goes. Okay. But my point, I was surprised they published it anyway, but my point was that 1989, and it goes farther back than this, but 1989 Ford represents theoretically the following wager: that what we can do is move away from the Westphalian idea of state sovereignty with citizens in it. And we can experiment with different nodal points of sovereignty, namely transnational globalism, and most importantly, subnational, and even sub-citizen, as in you as a bearer of identity. And so I characterize this moment as the experiment with supranational and subnational sovereignties, identity politics and globalization. I think these two go together because they're both opposed to Westphalia. And part of the reason why I think this is important to recognize is that I don't see this as a populist moment. I think it's dangerous to go in the direction of populism, because then at its best, you set this up as Jefferson versus Hamilton. At its worst, and we're already seeing this, you set this up as irrationalism versus the rationalism of the global elites. And I don't see it in those terms. I see it as Tocqueville versus the French Revolution. And any number of speakers, Rusty, especially talking about home, got this Tocquevillian point, which was that after the French Revolution, something was unleashed. Maybe it happened before, but this idea of universal cosmopolitan man. And what the globalists are saying is that's the only rational position to take. And I think Tocqueville's position is no. We're always embodied, embedded beings. And that the rational position, so to speak, is the one which recognizes our home. And so I don't want to talk about populism versus irrationalism versus rationalism, populism. I want to say it's a return to what Westphalia taught us. And this is where Hobbes is terribly important. What Westphalia taught us, which is the state matters. Okay? And within the state, not identity-bearing persons who have grievances and who are involved in politics through activism, which is exactly what the left wants us to think. That's not where we go. What we need to do is think of ourselves, and this is exactly what Trump got, as citizens, not white people, not this other kind of person, but as a citizen. And so I'm holding my breath to see if Trump can make good on that. But my view is this identity politics thing is deeply, deeply pernicious. And I'll talk about this tomorrow in the context of Martin Luther King as well. Now, I mentioned Hobbes a second ago. Hobbes already saw this a long time ago. Hobbes is arguing, if you read him beyond this, he's just the bringer of individualism. If you read him deeply theologically, what you see was he's arguing against two groups. He's arguing against what could be called the false universalism of what he perceived to be the Roman Catholic Church and the false universalism of the radical particularism of the Presbyterians, which is another way of saying two different sites of sovereignty, right, as opposed to the state. And so Hobbes saw this long ago. He knew that people were going to constantly flirt with sub and supra notions of sovereignty. And this is what we have been doing post-1989. And so I see Trump as a return to a sensible Westphalian understanding of the state. Now, I would modify this if I had time and talk about the limitations of Hobbes and bring in Tocqueville. But let me just say one last thing here. Am I conservative? Yes, but I don't think, here I'm going to throw the bomb, I don't think we can win by recurring to Burke. Just don't think so. After 2012 election, I was teaching a course, it was back at the main campus for Bidded, teaching a course on Tocqueville, and a lot of conservative students were feeling like many Democrats are now. And I said, look, of course you lost. You lost because, and I come back to Lewis Hartz and Tocqueville, equality has won in America. It has won. And if you sound like Burke, concerned with the Jacobin impulses of equality, you're not going to win the hearts and minds of Americans. And so my argument is you have to follow Tocqueville, not Burke. Because what Tocqueville understood was there's only one possible way that you can save variety, by which I will here insert, or in which I will here insert religious communities of all sorts of different shades and types. And that's through federalism. And this is my worry about the talk about nationalism simply, is that it strikes me that the Tocquevillian genius is that the great temptation of the modern world, and I think Yoram sees this as well, is this tendency toward universalism, which strips us of any particular important history that has constituted us. And so while I do say conservatism is a wonderful idea, my worry is that the liberalizing, the impulse toward equality has so penetrated that we have to accept that equality is one. And the Tocquevillian point, which I think is absolutely brilliant, is you say because equality is one, it produces all these anomic effects of individualism. And because of this, you have to defend federalism. You have to defend religious pluralism. You have to defend localism. But I think if you start from Burke with a certain suspicion that all equality leads to Jacobinism, you're in real trouble and you cannot win. So I want to suggest that we don't completely give the term liberal over to the left, because I think if we have this bimodal possibility of liberal as in left versus conservative, I don't think we're going to win. But I think if you have three modes, the left, who claims that they're liberal, but you say, no, you're not liberal. Liberal means something else. Tocquevillian liberal is what I think we need to defend. And that through that path, I think you can defend the things that conservatives want. But it's going to have to be a federal liberty. And that's the piece of the nationalism argument that I think we are missing at this point, which we have to have. So while I'm saddened that I had to abandon my early career in Reformation thinking, I'm glad that I turned to Tocqueville, because I think finally he gives us a way to understand how we can save religion. I think it has to be through federalism.